You talk about seeing the world from an Asian perspective, which requires small and large modifications in how we view the world. Why is that important?
It's so very important because, the global history of today is written in the English language, often by Western scholars, and often with Eurocentric prisms and theories and analogies to help us predict countries' behavior. And we apply those almost in a default way to Asia. But as I point out, they make almost no sense whatsoever, because we tend to look at Asian nations through the prism of sovereignty, rather than through culture and civilization and empire, as it were. Asia is a collection of historical empires that never really had fixed boundaries between them. In fact, some of the biggest challenges in Asia today are really about how to grapple with the boundaries, sovereign, formal borders that are so recent in their invention and imposition, if you will. So that's one part of the argument. But there's very, very important ones also around culture. Because when we use a Eurocentric frame to explain Asia, we tend to think of Asia like Europe, which is a small, self-contained geography with competing fraternal, almost, powers, right, that are culturally very similar, homogenous. In history, whether it's Napoleon or Hitler, it was conceivable to a European leader that they could actually conquer their neighbor and impose their Protestantism or Catholicism, French or German, on their neighbors, and they would have to learn it. Now think about Asia. Is any such thing actually possible? Of course, the Japanese tried it in a limited geography. Didn't last very long. The last time there was a pan-Asian empire was the Mongols 700 years ago. How did the Mongols survive? By adapting to local cultures and customs. It was the Mongols who changed their religion, not the other way around. So why is this so important? Because Asia is the most diverse, heterogeneous region of the planet Earth. Right? It is these civilizations that are so rich and so distinct, almost mutually unintelligible, that no one of them could actually conquer the other. So rather than conquer my neighbor and subjugate them and make them like me, which is almost a European sort of thumbnail history of modern, of Europe, in Asia, it's different. It's live and let live, right? It's sort of course, we could never actually conquer each other culturally, intellectually, religiously, philosophically. We have such rich traditions. We have to find other ways to come together.
So, European century, U.S. century, Asian century. How are we going to see these differentiated?
It goes back to this question about the fear of one system replacing another system and one power replacing another power. The framework I use in the book is that history is a set of layers or soil and sedimentary layers that enrich each other and fertilize each other. So the world has learned so much from the 19th century of Europeanization. If you think about Enlightenment values, parliamentary democratic systems, and all of these kinds of cultural virtues that Europe spread around the world. Then came the American system, and there was a love of freedom and entrepreneurialism and so forth. And now you have an Asian century.
A new century and new values around business, politics, and society.
And Asian values like, yes, sort of the voice of the people and democratic consultation is important, but what about the leadership with the far-sighted vision? Are they meritocratically selected? Do they have a collective view for uplifting the entire population? Or are they going to let inequality and division take over, where a public is divided over what the priorities should be? And what about the role of the state in the economy? In orthodox, economics, it's laissez-faire free markets. But Asians, whether democratic or non-democratic, are very, very comfortable with the idea that actually, the government has to play a role in stimulating certain industries and making sure the people are trained for the jobs and skills of the future. They think that's a good thing. Japan, China, South Korea, India are all trying to do that. And then there's certainly a social dimension, right? Asians are cautious about the embrace of total freedom, liberty, and so on, social media, being able to say whatever you want, because they see what a negative impact that can have in dividing frail, multi-ethnic societies, and instead say, let's be very, very careful to regulate these technologies so that they don't create social division. And I think that the more I live in Asia and the more I witness how these three new Asian values are playing out, the more I actually become an advocate for them. It's what can the West potentially learn from the way Asia is adapting some of the things that it's learned from the 18th and 19th century and 20th century experience to its own 21st century context.
It's impossible to talk about the rise of Asia without talking about the rise of China. Since 1978, the Chinese gross domestic product rose from $218.5 million to $12.3 trillion in 2017, transforming a once impoverished agrarian country into the world's second largest economy. In other words, China's GDP today is 60 times bigger than it was just 4 decades ago.
Here's one of the interesting things about your book. It starts off very early on with this quote from Napoleon, and I'll read it.
Right.
It's about China. Let her sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world. Is China wide awake? Is it just beginning to come out of its slumber? How do you see China at this stage?
I think that whereas a quote like that comes from the 18th century gives the impression that things operate over very slow, long time cycles, the truth is that China is awake. And it's been awake for about 40 years, almost to the day. When you think about the opening of the economy and the reforms kicked off by Deng Xiaoping, there is an expectation outside of China and maybe in the West that, again, to become a superpower takes a long time. Look at the experience of Great Britain over the centuries and America, but actually everything moves faster because of the flows of technology and the globalization of supply chains and so forth. So yes, today already China is awake, it's alert, it's global, it's a superpower. China, for me, was one of the anchors of that tripolar world that I laid out: the United States, the European Union, and China. So to me, it's not a revelation, and it shouldn't be a revelation that China is already, awake. But it isn't just China. To me, it's all of Asia that is collectively resurrected. So if we have an ahistorical view where we just look right now at this moment, we'd be saying China's rise is the big story in the world. And I would say that actually the Asianization of Asia, Asia coming back together, is the biggest story in the world. And China is a huge part of that story, which is to say that it's even bigger than just the China story, which is already so big. So I think that China is not only awoken, but one of the things that I like to talk about and discuss, and what I think we're going to experience and embrace more in the coming decade or 2 decades, is that China has woken Asians up that they can actually recreate this Asian system. And it wouldn't have happened without the rise of China.
China represents only half of Asia's GDP, half of capital outside of Asia, and 1.4 billion of Asia's nearly 5 billion people. As China's economic growth slows down, other Asian countries' economies are accelerating. And they're not just the developed economies of Singapore and South Korea. India has overtaken China to become the fastest growing economy. The service sector is the dominant economic driver. The country has made leaps, especially in the world of tech. Indian IT firms generated an all-time high in revenue of $167 billion in 2017-2018. Southeast Asia earned its nickname of Factory of the World for becoming a manufacturing destination, with Japanese, Korean, and Chinese firms outsourcing to this region. And in Central Asia, Kazakhstan has been resurrected as a crucial hub between Asia and Europe.
This comes early in your book. You talk about the Asian Economic Zone. It represents 50% of global GDP and 2/3 of global economic growth. And I think that's one of the things I really like about your book is the context and stitching together all of these pieces of information to make your point.
Yeah. There's a lot of insights baked into the data that I'm just elevating, right? One is that we should measure economies in purchasing power parity terms, not just in US dollar terms. So that's something that economists have argued, and what I do is I take that insight and I apply it to Asia, and then what you see is, my goodness, Asians consume mostly Asian goods at Asian prices. Why would we measure their economies in US dollar terms? And when you make that calculation, you clearly see China is not the second largest economy in the world, it's the largest economy in the world, no question about it, by quite a bit already. And India is not just a $3,000 a year per capita income country in US dollar terms, it's about $7,000 a year per capita in purchasing power parity terms. So you take those standard, almost indisputable economic metrics, and you wind up with an Asian picture that's an even bigger story than we tend to think right now.
Purchasing power parity. Think of it like a theoretical exchange rate that allows you to buy the same goods and services in every country, controlling for different prices and costs of living. Based on purchasing power parity, China became the world's largest economy in 2014. And China's not just buying made in China. It's also importing roughly 430 billion US dollars worth of goods from the rest of Asia, meaning more than half of China's imports come from other Asian countries.
To this day, of course, Asian countries are where you see that globalization is still very popular. Everyone wants, more open trade liberalization. Most of the world's trade agreements are happening right now between Asian countries. So the sort of backward-looking, inward-looking, cynical, pessimistic kind of attitude that is characterized by sort of Trump and Brexit and the phenomena of the government shutdowns and the British gridlock over what to do next, you don't really see that in Asia.
When it comes to global trade, Europe and Asia are the two main hubs, each region accounting for more than a third of the value of goods traded. North America accounts for 14% of the global value of traded goods. China, Japan, and South Korea account for $4.2 trillion in annual exports, the same as the EU and North America combined.
I do want to talk about Asia more broadly, but staying with China just a little bit. This concept of shaking the world, do you think that's what's behind Obama's pivot to Asia, Trump's trade war with China, that there's this fixation that, oh boy, wait a minute, it's growing too fast, it's having too much dominance?
I would say the fixation of China really does go back almost to the immediate post-Cold War period. In the 1990s, when in the American defense establishment, they were scanning the world and looking for what the next peer competitor nation might be. Of course, China came up then. China tensions in the region obviously had flared up in the 1990s, and that was a big issue. So whether it is the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, or the Trump administration, there is a continuity in the sense that China in particular and Asia in general are getting more and more focus. There was a period in between that we now think of as the distraction of the war on terror and the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and how those wars have not gone well. And so that's the context with which to view this pivot. The idea that the West Asian conflicts have not gone so well. Let's refocus on the great powers, and that means focusing on East Asia, focusing on the economic opportunity through trade and the geopolitical challenge through alliances. So that's really what was intended. But now, bear in mind, we're about almost 5-6 years on from that point in time. Clearly that just because there is an alert or a heightened response from the United States to the rise of China in Asia, it doesn't mean that response is coherent or meaningful or effective or sensible, or that its allies or other states actually agree with it. That's where we are now, and that brings us to the trade war.
By 2004, trade within Asia surpassed Asia's trade with developed countries. Parag says this is what insulated the region from the 2007 financial crisis in the West. Intra-Asian trade is also what's helping safeguard China from trade wars. Parag says China's strategy, specifically from the United States, can be summed up in 2 words: permanent substitution. Take computer chips as just one example. The United States has halted its supplies to China, but in the meantime, China is courting Asian companies to share their chip-making expertise.
It's been 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And whereas, Western capitals and powers have been obsessed with a wide range of domestic or their own foreign policy issues, Asians have quite relentlessly been integrating with each other. And we see that happening in energy markets. The West Asian energy suppliers now sell most of their oil and gas across the Indian Ocean to China, to South Korea, to Japan, to India as well. Then we see the integration of trade in other areas. In agriculture, we see it in industrial goods, we see it in financial services and the flows of capital.
It's not just money and goods crossing borders, people are too. In 2017, 1 in 3 migrants in the world were Asians, moving to other Asian countries. Increased connections over land and by air mean Asians are traveling more for leisure too, learning each other's history and heritage.
Asians travel more within Asia than they do the rest of the world. Again, whether you're in France or England or America, it's like, wow, look at the growing volumes of Japanese and Chinese and Indian tourists. Well, hold on. That's actually a fraction of the number of Asians that are actually visiting each other's countries for the first time. Much, much larger intra-Asian diplomacy and commerce and tourism. So those are the things that I also wanted to measure and bring to life. Part of my motivation was to explain Asia to Asians, actually, right? Because, of course, with such large and self-contained civilizations like India and China and Japan are, they haven't had the need to really understand each other that deeply. But now the mentality in each country has to catch up with the reality that they are actually quite interdependent.
Interdependence, a challenge to the traditional Western narrative of one global superpower.
You talk about growing up in New York. You live in Singapore now. I want to get your take on some of the interviews that you've done about the book and talks that you've given. Because I've watched a few of them, and one of them, it seemed as though the interviewer was rather hostile. It almost kind of gave me the point of view of this is almost like a sports contest, and he's rooting for his side to win. And if China and Asia are on the rise, his side's losing. And there's kind of this anger in some of the questions lobbied at you. I'm just curious, do you see that? And does one have to lose in order for the other to, do you see it as a win-lose perspective?
It's actually very rare that happens, because most people, most of the time, are like us in the sense that they're actually open, they want to learn, they appreciate what they don't know. I could be talking to a taxi driver, here in New York or elsewhere in America who, in conversation it comes up, I've done a book or something and they want to talk, they want to learn. And then down at the human level, that's how people actually are. One of the things that I've gone to great pains to emphasize in all of my books is that we are not in a zero-sum world, actually. We are in a truly unprecedented period of history. Not even the historical periods that I've referred to earlier explain how today, for the first time in human history, we live in a totally distributed, multipolar world. Right? That has never happened before, where North America is a global power, Europe has a global influence, and you have not only one Asian power, but multiple Asian powers. So in that sense, as much as I write about history, let's not get too fixated on historical analogy, because this is truly unique. And therefore, again, just like the Eurocentric kind of prism doesn't apply, the old rules of power transitions and one must decline for the other to rise also simply do not apply. It quite frankly bothers me, I'll be honest with you, that even Asians, including Chinese and Japanese and Indians, have picked up on the terminology, on the frames of reference, on the historical models that are offered by the Western academic kind of system, because they are so biased and premised on a very narrow reading of European history. They bear no relevance to a distributed global landscape in which the geography is much broader, the value system is much different, the ambitions and goals different. I'll give you just one example. When it comes to talking about, are you a superpower, are you not a superpower? We often say, well, only America right now has a global military capability and capacity to project power all over the world. And I say to myself, well, how would an Asian take that statement? Does an Asian power such as China really want to have aircraft carriers patrolling the South Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Brazil? Is that what would make China a superpower? Or does being powerful in Asia, which is where the majority of the world population and economy is, does that matter more? Right? And so why do I bring this up? Because whereas in the past, the conception of what makes a superpower is how globally distributed are you. In the 21st century, in Asian century, if you will, what matters most is being influential in Asia.
Some people don't want to hear what you just said.
But it's good news, right? If you're willing to be open to the fact that opportunity is global and not just local, right? Which is, again, should be good news to whoever it is that's listening, then I think one should actually embrace it. Again, what the trade war is proving, for example, is how bad it is for American business to almost be voluntarily cut off from the Chinese and Asian markets by not joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, by having these reciprocal and sort of tariff escalation with China and so forth. So people may not want to hear that they are not the center of the universe, but what if they could understand that the fact that we have many constellations, in the sky, is actually good for them, and it means that their markets are global and they can actually profit more and they have more opportunities, right? And so often only one narrow part of the story gets told, and it happens to be the wrong story, but I try to give the big picture.